Midnight, December. A city of 1 million sleeps beneath a winter sky in central India. The air is cold, cold enough that vapor hangs close to the ground, pooling in the alleys of the slums that press against the factory walls. Cold enough that families huddle together under thin blankets, their small fires burning low. Inside the pesticide plant, a pressure gauge begins to climb. Tank E610. 42 tons of a chemical so volatile that the safety manual runs to hundreds of pages. A chemical that the workers call the devil's breath. Methyl isocyanate, MIC. At 11:30 p.m., an operator notices something wrong. His eyes sting. There's a leak somewhere in the MIC unit. He reports it to his supervisor. The supervisor tells him to wait. They'll deal with it after the tea break. By the time they understand what is happening, it's already too late. In the next 3 hours, between 30 and 40 tons of toxic gas will pour from that tank into the cold December air. The cloud will drift south and east, silent as a ghost, heavier than air, settling into streets and homes and lungs. People will wake with burning eyes, coughing, gasping, choking on their own secretions. They will run, some toward the gas, thinking it comes from behind them. Some carrying children who are already dead. By dawn, the streets of Bhopal will be littered with corpses. Human beings and animals alike, cows, dogs, birds fallen from trees. The city will look like the aftermath of a war nobody saw coming. Official estimates will place the immediate death toll at roughly 2,200. Independent researchers will put it closer to 8,000 in the first week alone. Over the following decades, another 15,000 to 20,000 will die from exposure-related illnesses. More than 500,000 people will suffer chronic health problems, reproductive disorders, blindness, lung disease. Children will be born with defects their parents cannot understand. Grandchildren, too. This is the story of how a corporation built its empire on chemistry and promises, how it cut corners and counted costs, how it treated workers as expendable and communities as afterthoughts, and how, when the bill finally came due, it walked away. The company's name was Union Carbide. And the question that echoes through 40 years of grief and litigation and denial is simple. Who pays when progress kills? Perhaps more unsettling, what happens when nobody does? The story of Union Carbide begins not in India, but in the factories and furnaces of early 20th century America. In 1898, in the coal country of Virginia, a man named Major James T. Moorhead founded the Union Carbide Company to manufacture calcium carbide. It was an unassuming beginning for what would become one of the most powerful chemical corporations on Earth. Calcium carbide had a peculiar property. When mixed with water, it produced acetylene gas, which could be burned for light. In the years before electric lights reached every home, acetylene lamps illuminated streets and carriages and factories across America. The business was good, the business was growing. But Thomas Edison's incandescent bulb was spreading faster. By the early 1900s, it was clear that acetylene lighting was a dying industry. Union Carbide needed to find new uses for its chemicals or face obsolescence. They found them. In 1917, in the final years of the First World War, 5 companies merged to form the Union Carbide and Carbon Corporation. They combined expertise in calcium carbide, industrial gases, carbon products, and acetylene technology. The American government needed supplies for the war effort. Union Carbide provided helium for balloons, ferrozirconium for artillery shells, activated carbon for gas masks. The war ended, but Union Carbide's ambitions were just beginning. In 1919, the company began producing synthetic ethylene from petroleum byproducts. It was a breakthrough that would transform the entire chemical industry. Ethylene could be converted into plastics, synthetic rubber, solvents, antifreeze, and thousands of other products. Union Carbide had stumbled onto the foundation of the modern petrochemical age. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, the company grew relentlessly. It acquired competitors and expanded into new markets. It introduced Preston Antifreeze, which became the best-selling brand in America. It developed Bakelite, the first truly synthetic plastic, through the acquisition of the Bakelite Corporation in 1939. It pioneered vinyl plastics and polyethylene. By mid-century, Union Carbide was one of the largest chemical companies in the world. Its products touched nearly every aspect of American life: batteries, plastics, industrial gases, pesticides, even nuclear materials, as the company operated the Oak Ridge National Laboratory where uranium was processed for the atomic bomb. The company's slogan was simple and confident, "A hand in things to come." But there was another side to Union Carbide's rise, a side that company executives rarely mentioned in their annual reports. A pattern that would repeat itself again and again over the decades, in different places and different circumstances, but always with the same essential shape. The shape of workers dying for the sake of profit. The shape of communities poisoned while corporations counted their earnings. The shape of a hand in things to come that left destruction in its wake. In 1927, Union Carbide needed electricity. Specifically, it needed hydroelectric power for a new metallurgical plant in Boncar, West Virginia. The plant would process ferroalloys, metals used in making steel. But the process required enormous amounts of energy. The solution was ambitious. The company would build a 3-mile tunnel through the heart of Gauley Mountain, diverting the New River to generate power. A private corporation would effectively purchase a major American river and use it for its own purposes. Neither state nor federal government raised any significant objection. Construction began in the spring of 1930. The Great Depression was devastating the nation. Unemployment was catastrophic. When word spread that there was work in the mountains of West Virginia, men came from across the country. Black men from the Deep South, poor white men from Appalachian hollows, immigrants looking for any wage at all. They found work. They also found something else. Gauley Mountain was composed of sandstone, not ordinary sandstone, but rock that was 99% pure silica. When the workers drilled and blasted their way through the mountain, they kicked up clouds of silica dust so thick that visibility inside the tunnel dropped to a few feet. The dust coated their skin. It filled their lungs with every breath. Silicosis was not an unknown disease in 1930. Physicians had been documenting it for centuries. The condition occurs when microscopic particles of crystalline silica become embedded in lung tissue, causing progressive scarring and fibrosis. The lungs grow stiff, breathing becomes difficult, then agonizing. There is no cure. The disease is always fatal. Union Carbide and its contractors knew the risks. Company engineers and inspectors wore respirators when they entered the tunnel. But the ordinary workers, the men drilling through the rock for 25 cents an hour, received neither masks nor warnings. According to testimony later given to Congress, when the director of the West Virginia Department of Mines inspected the tunnel and ordered that respirators be provided to all workers, his orders were ignored. One company official was reported to have said that he would not give $2.50 for all the workers on the job. Workers began dying within months of entering the tunnel. Company doctors diagnosed their illnesses as tunnelitis or pneumonia. Death certificates were falsified. Bodies were buried in unmarked graves before families could be notified. Black workers, who made up the majority of the underground workforce, were not permitted burial in white cemeteries. Some were interred along the roadsides near the tunnel, their graves covered with rock blasted from the mountain. The tunnel was projected to take 4 years to complete. Union Carbide finished it in 18 months. The death toll will never be precisely known. Congressional testimony placed it at 476. The company's internal estimate admitted to 109. An epidemiologist named Martin Cherniak, after years of research, concluded that at least 764 men died of acute silicosis within 5 years of the tunnel's completion. Some estimates range as high as 2,000 dead. In 1936, the House of Representatives convened hearings on the disaster. The Congressional Committee concluded that the tunnel had been constructed with, and I quote, "grave and inhuman disregard of all consideration for the health, lives, and futures of the employees." Congress took no action against the companies responsible. Union Carbide never admitted guilt. The families of the dead received settlements averaging less than $200. The Hawks Nest Tunnel disaster became, for a time, America's worst industrial catastrophe. Folk singers wrote ballads about the dead men. Poets composed elegies. The West Virginia state legislature eventually passed workers' compensation laws that included protection from silicosis. The families of the dead received pittances. Legal settlements averaged less than $200 per victim. Attorneys took half. Black families were offered less than white families, even in death. $400 for a dead black son, $600 for a dead black husband, as if the color of a man's skin determined the value of his life. In 1935, the West Virginia legislature passed new workers' compensation laws that included protection from silicosis. But the law included a statute of limitations so short that many victims were already ineligible by the time it passed. The dying continued for years, but the legal window for claims had already closed. The company never apologized. When approached by journalists decades later, Union Carbide declined to comment on Hawk's Nest. The records were lost. The graves were unmarked. The dead were forgotten, except by those who loved them and those who wrote songs and poems to keep their memory alive. Muriel Rukeyser, the American poet, visited Gauley Bridge in 1936 and wrote a sequence of poems called The Book of the Dead. She documented the disaster through verse, giving voice to the silenced workers. "What three things can never be done?" she wrote. "Forget, keep silent, stand alone." The survivors and descendants of Hawk's Nest have not forgotten. In 2009, a memorial was installed near the tunnel site, acknowledging what had happened. It came more than 70 years after the last worker died. It changed nothing for the dead, but it meant something to the living. What Hawk's Nest revealed was not an anomaly, but a template, a pattern of corporate behavior that would repeat itself across decades and continents. The willingness to sacrifice workers for profit, the denial of known risks, the falsification of records, the manipulation of legal systems to avoid accountability. Union Carbide learned from Hawk's Nest, not the lesson that human lives matter more than quarterly earnings, not the lesson that corporations have moral obligations to their workers, not the lesson that safety standards exist for a reason. The lesson Union Carbide learned was how to get away with it. But Union Carbide continued to grow. The tunnel still operates today, still generating power. The company that built it on the bodies of migrant workers went on to become a giant of American industry. And the pattern was established: the willingness to sacrifice human lives for the sake of speed and profit. The refusal to provide basic safety equipment when doing so might slow production or reduce margins. The falsification of records and the burial of evidence. The denial of responsibility, even in the face of overwhelming proof. It was a pattern that would repeat itself half a century later, on a vastly larger scale, in a city 10,000 miles away. In the decades following World War II, Union Carbide expanded aggressively into international markets. The company saw opportunity in the developing world, where regulations were looser, labor was cheaper, and demand for industrial chemicals was growing. India was a particularly attractive market. The country's population was enormous and largely agricultural. The government, under Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, had embraced modernization and invited foreign investment in strategic industries. And Indian farmers, struggling with pest infestations that destroyed crops and spread disease, represented a massive potential customer base for pesticides. In 1969, Union Carbide established a pesticide formulation plant in the city of Bhopal, in the central Indian state of Madhya Pradesh. The location was chosen for its central position and access to rail networks. The site itself was zoned for light industrial and commercial use, not for hazardous industry. Initially, the Bhopal plant simply mixed and packaged pesticides using chemicals imported from Union Carbide's facility in Institute, West Virginia. This was a relatively simple and safe operation, but competition in the pesticide market was fierce, and profit margins were thin. Union Carbide decided to implement what it called backward integration, manufacturing the raw chemical ingredients on site rather than importing them. This meant producing methyl isocyanate in Bhopal. MIC is an intermediate chemical used in the production of carbamate pesticides. It is also one of the most dangerous industrial chemicals in existence. The substance is colorless and has a sharp, pungent odor. It evaporates readily at temperatures above freezing. In concentrations as low as a few parts per million, it irritates the eyes and lungs. At higher concentrations, it causes pulmonary edema, the flooding of the lungs with fluid. Exposure to concentrated MIC vapor is rapidly fatal. The threshold limit value for occupational exposure, the maximum concentration considered safe for workers, is 0.02 parts per million. At 2 parts per million, the eyes begin to water uncontrollably. At 21 parts per million, the irritation becomes unbearable. Above that, the damage to the lungs becomes severe. Methyl isocyanate does not merely irritate the respiratory system, it corrodes it. The chemical reacts with the moisture in lung tissue, generating heat and destroying cells. Victims essentially drown in the fluid that their damaged lungs produce. The process can take hours or days. It is agonizing. Those who survive acute exposure often face a lifetime of respiratory problems. Chronic bronchitis, asthma, interstitial lung disease. The scarring in the lungs does not heal. It accumulates over time, making breathing increasingly difficult. Many survivors of Bhopal became what doctors call respiratory cripples, unable to perform basic physical tasks without gasping for air. The chemical also affects the eyes, causing severe irritation that can lead to corneal damage and blindness. Reproductive systems are damaged. Studies found elevated rates of spontaneous abortions and stillbirths among exposed women. Neurological effects include memory problems, difficulty concentrating, and chronic headaches. And the chemical reacts violently with water. When MIC and water combine, the reaction generates enormous heat, which causes more MIC to vaporize, which generates more heat, in a runaway chain reaction that is extremely difficult to control. This is precisely what happened in Bhopal. Union Carbide began manufacturing MIC at the Bhopal facility in 1980. The plant was designed to be a replica of the company's MIC facility in Institute, West Virginia, but it was not, in fact, a true replica. In 2002, internal Union Carbide documents revealed that the technology used at Bhopal was what company engineers called unproven. To trim costs, the company did not install safety devices and protocols that had been tested and proven effective at its American and European plants. The Bhopal facility had lower standards for equipment maintenance. It had fewer safety systems. It had less redundancy. The Indian government had a 22% stake in Union Carbide India Limited, the subsidiary that operated the Bhopal plant. But effective control rested with the American parent company. Union Carbide Corporation approved the plant's design. It provided the technology and the chemical processes. It set the standards for operation and maintenance. And when those standards began to slip, when budgets were cut and safety systems deteriorated, it was Union Carbide Corporation that made those decisions. By the early 1980s, the Bhopal plant was in trouble. The Indian market for pesticides had not grown as fast as expected. Competition had driven down prices. The facility was operating at only a quarter of its production capacity. It was losing money. Union Carbide's response was to cut costs. The company reduced the workforce. The number of operators handling MIC dropped from 12 to 6. The maintenance staff was slashed. The night shift, when the disaster would eventually occur, was left without a maintenance supervisor. Instrument readings that were supposed to be taken every hour were stretched to every 2 hours. Safety systems were allowed to deteriorate. The refrigeration unit that normally kept the MIC storage tanks cool was drained of its coolant and repurposed for another part of the plant. The gas flare tower, designed to burn off toxic emissions, had been out of service for months. The vent gas scrubber, which was supposed to neutralize any MIC that escaped the storage tanks, was turned off. Workers complained through their union. They were ignored. One employee went on a 15-day hunger strike to protest the deteriorating conditions. He was fired. 70% of the plant's employees were disciplined for refusing to deviate from proper safety regulations under pressure from management. In 1982, a safety audit conducted by Union Carbide's own engineers identified numerous serious deficiencies at the Bhopal plant. The report was known internally as the Tyson Report. It documented problems with equipment maintenance, safety protocols, and worker training. Some of its recommendations were implemented, many were not. Between 1981 and 1984, there were at least 6 serious accidents at the plant involving toxic chemicals. In December 1981, a phosgene leak killed 1 worker and hospitalized dozens more. In January 1982, another leak exposed 24 workers to toxic fumes. In October of that year, an MIC leak injured 2 supervisors. A local journalist named Rajkumar Keswani began publishing articles in the Bhopal press, warning that the city was sitting on the edge of a volcano. His warnings were ignored. On the night of December 2, 1984, the volcano erupted. The exact sequence of events that led to the disaster remains disputed. Union Carbide has maintained for 40 years that the leak was caused by sabotage, by a disgruntled employee who deliberately introduced water into the MIC storage tank. Independent investigators and the Indian government have rejected this theory. What is not disputed is this. On the night of December 2nd, workers were attempting to clean pipes in the MIC unit. A valve that should have been closed was open. A sliding closure that should have been in place had been removed and not replaced. And the maintenance supervisor, who would normally have verified that proper procedures were followed, had been eliminated from the night shift in the cost-cutting measures. Water entered tank E610. At 11 SATA p.m., an operator noticed that the pressure inside the tank was higher than normal, though still within the working range. He did not investigate further. At 11:30, workers detected a small leak of MIC vapor near the vent gas scrubber. They reported it to the shift supervisor. The supervisor, following standard practice at the undermanned facility, told them to wait. They would deal with it after the tea break, scheduled for 12:15. By midnight, the pressure inside tank E610 was climbing rapidly. The exothermic reaction between the MIC and the water was accelerating. Heat was building. More MIC was vaporizing. The pressure gauge climbed past normal parameters. At 12:15 a.m. on December 3rd, workers attempted to start the vent gas scrubber to neutralize the escaping gas. The system would not function properly. It had been inadequately maintained. At 12:30, the pressure inside the tank reached dangerous levels. Workers could feel radiated heat from the tank walls. They could hear rumbling sounds from within. The safety valve was shrieking. At approximately 1 a.m., the safety valve gave way entirely. A column of toxic gas shot upward from the tank and began spreading over the city. The gas emerged at high temperature from the violent reaction, but the cold December night cooled it rapidly. MIC vapor is denser than air, approximately 1.4 times heavier. As it cooled, it sank toward the ground, settling into the low-lying areas where the poorest residents of Bhopal lived. The slums around the factory were crowded and poorly ventilated. Homes were constructed of whatever materials people could find. Doors and windows did not seal properly. The gas flowed into homes like water into a sinking ship, filling every space, reaching every lung. The cloud spread at walking pace, roughly 3 to 5 miles per hour. This was fast enough to overtake people who were fleeing, but slow enough that some managed to escape by running in the right direction. Those who ran south, away from the factory, had a chance. Those who ran north or east, toward the thickest concentrations, did not. The gas was denser at ground level, where children breathe. A child standing in the same location as an adult would have been exposed to higher concentrations. This is one reason why the death toll among children was so high. Their lungs were smaller, more vulnerable. They breathed in more poison relative to their body weight. They died faster. The plant had 2 sirens, one for internal warnings to workers, one to alert the surrounding community. The 2 systems had been disconnected from each other in 1982. When a worker activated the alarm at 12:50 a.m., only the internal siren sounded. The public warning system was briefly activated, then quickly shut off. No one warned the city. The gas cloud spread south and southeast, pushed by light winds, hugging the ground because it was denser than the cold night air. It rolled through the narrow streets of the settlements that had grown up around the factory walls, settlements that should never have been built so close to a hazardous industrial facility. Settlements where some of the poorest residents of Bhopal lived in crowded, poorly ventilated shelters. People woke choking. Their eyes burned. They coughed up foam. Some ran outside into the thickest concentrations of the gas. Some stayed inside, covering themselves with wet blankets on the advice of relatives who worked at the plant. It made little difference. The gas found them either way. Families were separated in the chaos. Parents lost children in the darkness. The blind led the blind through streets filled with bodies. At Bhopal's hospitals, doctors had no idea what they were dealing with. Union Carbide had never provided information about how to treat MIC exposure. The company claimed the data was a trade secret. Physicians tried standard treatments for respiratory distress. Many were ineffective. Some may have made things worse. The standard treatment for chemical inhalation is to administer oxygen and bronchodilators. But MIC does not merely irritate the airways, it destroys lung tissue. The treatments that might help with less severe exposures were inadequate for the catastrophic damage caused by concentrated MIC. Some doctors tried to wash patients' eyes with water, not knowing that MIC reacts with water and that the washing might cause additional harm. Others administered injections that had no effect on the underlying poisoning. There were no antidotes, there were no protocols. The medical community was fighting blind against an enemy it did not understand. The hospitals were overwhelmed within hours. People lay dying in corridors and parking lots. There were not enough doctors, not enough oxygen, not enough anything. Hamidia Hospital, the largest medical facility in Bhopal, received thousands of patients in the first hours. The emergency room was designed to handle perhaps 100 patients at a time. It received many times that number. Bodies piled up in corridors. Living patients lay next to dead ones. The morgue overflowed. Doctors and nurses worked until they collapsed. Some of them were themselves affected by the gas, treating patients while their own lungs burned. A nurse in one hospital had to stop performing CPR because her own respiratory problems made it impossible to continue. A forensic specialist who stayed to document the deaths contracted lung disease that would eventually kill him. The chaos extended beyond the hospitals. The police did not know what had happened. The fire department did not know how to respond. Government officials were as confused as everyone else. The mechanisms of emergency response, inadequate as they were, broke down entirely under the scale of the disaster. By dawn, the gas had dispersed enough that the immediate killing stopped. But the dying continued, in morgues and hospitals, in homes where the injured lingered. In the weeks and months that followed, as exposure-related diseases took their toll, workers from the municipal sanitation department drove through the streets collecting bodies. They loaded corpses onto trucks, stacking them like cordwood. They dumped them in mass graves or delivered them to cremation sites where fires burned continuously. One driver later gave testimony about that night. He said that he had loaded thousands of bodies onto his truck, that in one grave he and his colleagues had buried more than 1,000 people together, that the smell and the scale of the death had been beyond anything he could have imagined. At the railway station, an entire tribe of traveling performers had been encamped when the gas arrived. Every one of them died. Men, women, children. No one survived to identify who they were or where they came from. Their deaths were never counted. A young boy named Sunil woke up in a pile of corpses in a town 20 miles from Bhopal. He had been gathered with the dead and loaded onto a truck for disposal. He was lucky enough to wake up before they set him on fire. These are the numbers. Estimates vary widely. Official Indian government figures place the immediate death toll at 2,259. The company accepted this figure. Independent researchers have argued that the true number was far higher, perhaps 8,000 in the first week alone. What is certain is that over 500,000 people were exposed to the gas. A government affidavit from 2006 documented more than 558,000 injuries, including nearly 4,000 severely and permanently disabling injuries. Long-term epidemiological studies have tracked elevated rates of cancer, respiratory disease, reproductive disorders, and birth defects in the affected population for decades. Children born to exposed parents show increased rates of developmental disabilities. Grandchildren, too. The genetic damage may persist for generations. The long-term health effects of mic exposure have been documented in study after study. Survivors exhibit damage to multiple organ systems: lungs, eyes, immune system, reproductive system, nervous system. The chemical did not merely kill, it wounded in ways that would last a lifetime. A study published in an international medical journal found that gas-exposed women suffered from a wide spectrum of gynecological problems for years after the disaster. Menstrual irregularities, excessive bleeding, inflammation, and infection. These problems persisted even in women who had been young children at the time of the exposure. Women who were pregnant during the gas leak experienced catastrophic outcomes. Among those living within 1 kilometer of the factory, 43% of pregnancies did not result in a live birth. Of the babies who were born alive, 14% died within the first month. The numbers were unprecedented. Children who survived the gas leak grew up with chronic health problems, developmental delays, learning disabilities, respiratory problems that limited their ability to play, to work, to live normal lives. Some never reached normal height because the gas had damaged their growth. And then there were the children born after the disaster to parents who had been exposed. These children showed elevated rates of birth defects, developmental problems, and chronic illness. The damage had been passed down, embedded in genes or caused by the ongoing contamination of the environment. Bati Bairajak was 4 years old on the night of the gas leak. She remembers her eyes burning, people running, the chaos in the streets. Her family covered themselves with wet blankets on the advice of an uncle who worked at the factory. Somehow, they survived the night. In the morning when they went outside, the streets were littered with corpses. Her family suffered severe health consequences, vision problems, respiratory problems. Her parents could not work. She left school in the 8th grade to help support the family. Her older brother, whose vision had been impaired by the gas, was trying to make an electrical repair at age 15, but could not see properly. He was electrocuted. Farhat Jahan was 5 months old when the gas leaked. She remembers nothing of that night, but her mother told her stories. The screaming in the streets, the thick gas entering their home. Her parents running with their children, getting separated in the confusion. Her mother finding a park and staying there all night with the infant Farhat. All of them survived initially, but the effects accumulated over decades. Her mother developed pulmonary fibrosis. One sister, who was 2 years old at the time of the disaster, has chronic renal failure and requires dialysis several times each week. Another sister died of renal failure at age 24, leaving behind 2 daughters, one of whom was born with severe birth defects. These are not statistics. These are human beings whose lives were shaped and damaged by a corporate decision to cut costs. The death toll, by any reasonable estimate, has reached somewhere between 15,000 and 25,000 over the 40 years since that night, and it continues to climb. On the morning of December 3, 1984, Union Carbide's headquarters in Danbury, Connecticut, received word of the disaster. The company's CEO, Warren Anderson, was informed immediately. He assembled a technical team and flew to India within days. Anderson was 63 years old, tall and patrician. He had risen through Union Carbide's ranks over 3 decades, becoming chairman and CEO in 1982. He had a reputation for competence and for devotion to the company. On his desk, he kept a plaque with the inscription, "A leader is best when people barely know he exists." Anderson arrived in Bhopal on December 7th, carrying with him an assurance of safe passage from India's foreign secretary. He later admitted that his primary purpose in coming was to head off lawsuits. What happened next remains one of the most controversial episodes in the entire Bhopal story. Upon arrival, Anderson was arrested by local police. He was charged with culpable homicide, a crime equivalent to manslaughter under Indian law. He was also charged with causing grievous hurt, causing death, and poisoning of animals. These were serious charges, carrying potential prison sentences of years or decades. Anderson was taken into custody. He was held at a guest house under what was described as house arrest, and then within hours, he was released on bail of 25,000 rupees, approximately $2,100. A government plane flew him to New Delhi. 2 days later, he left India. He never returned. The circumstances of his release have been the subject of investigation and accusation for 4 decades. The bail was granted despite the fact that culpable homicide was a non-bailable offense under Indian law. The Chief Minister of Madhya Pradesh, Arjun Singh, personally ensured Anderson's safe passage to the airport. Singh later claimed he was acting on orders from the Union Home Ministry in New Delhi. The Prime Minister of India at the time was Rajiv Gandhi. His government has been accused of facilitating Anderson's escape as part of a diplomatic arrangement with the United States. Some have pointed to the fact that 6 months after Anderson's release, President Ronald Reagan granted a pardon to an associate of the Gandhi family who was serving a long prison sentence in America. The connection has never been definitively proven, but the timing has fueled decades of speculation. What is certain is that Anderson's bail bond included a commitment that he would appear whenever and wherever he was directed by the police or the court. He never honored that commitment. In 1987, the Indian government summoned Anderson and other Union Carbide executives to appear in court on homicide charges. Union Carbide responded that the company was not under Indian jurisdiction. In 1992, a Bhopal court declared Anderson a fugitive from justice and issued a non-bailable warrant for his arrest. The Indian government requested his extradition from the United States in 2003. The request was declined. Anderson spent the rest of his life in comfortable retirement in the United States. He lived in homes in Florida and Long Island. He refused all requests for interviews. His phone was unlisted. His lawyers advised journalists that he would not discuss Bhopal under any circumstances. In 2014, just before the 30th anniversary of the disaster, Warren Anderson died in a nursing home in Vero Beach, Florida. He was 92 years old. He had never faced trial for the deaths in Bhopal. He had never set foot in India after December 1984. The survivors of the disaster had a slogan that they chanted at protests in the years after September 11, 2001, when the United States was hunting Osama bin Laden across the globe. The slogan was this: "You want Osama? Give us Anderson." The demand was never met. While Anderson evaded justice, Union Carbide was fighting to limit its liability in courtrooms around the world. The legal battle began almost immediately after the disaster. Within weeks, American attorneys had filed lawsuits in U.S. courts seeking billions of dollars in damages for the Bhopal victims. The plaintiffs argued that American courts were the proper venue because Union Carbide Corporation, the American parent company, bore ultimate responsibility for the design and operation of the Bhopal plant. Union Carbide fought to have the cases dismissed. The company argued that Union Carbide India Limited was a separate entity, that the American parent had no direct control over the plant's operations, and that Indian courts were the appropriate forum for any litigation. This argument was remarkable in light of what Union Carbide executives had said in the immediate aftermath of the disaster. Vice President Jackson Browning had explained that the company's employees in India complied with all laws and that the corporation was satisfied with the facilities and their operation. CEO Anderson had described his visit to Bhopal as essential to give backbone to our India company. The company's claims of separation also contradicted the realities of corporate control. Union Carbide Corporation held a majority stake in the Indian subsidiary. It approved the plant's design. It provided the technology. It appointed key executives. It conducted safety audits. It made the decisions that led to cost-cutting and deteriorating safety standards. Nevertheless, the American courts accepted Union Carbide's arguments. In 1986, Judge John Keenan of the U.S. District Court in New York dismissed the cases against Union Carbide and redirected them to Indian courts. The judge reasoned that India was the more appropriate forum, given that the disaster occurred there, the victims lived there, and the evidence was located there. The decision was a devastating blow to the victims. The Indian legal system was slow, underfunded, and ill-equipped to handle litigation against a multinational corporation with vast legal resources. Compensation that might have been substantial under American law would be a fraction of that amount under Indian standards. In 1989, the Indian Supreme Court brokered a settlement. Union Carbide agreed to pay $470 million to the Indian government, which would distribute the funds to the victims. In exchange, the company would be released from all civil liability. Criminal charges, which had been pending against Union Carbide and its executives, were quashed as part of the agreement. The settlement worked out to roughly $500 per victim, for families who had lost breadwinners, for individuals who would require medical care for the rest of their lives, for children born with disabilities, $500. Union Carbide's stock price rose 7% on the day the settlement was announced. The company was worth approximately $10 billion at the time. The settlement represented less than 5% of its market value. For comparison, Union Carbide was simultaneously settling asbestos claims from American workers. Those settlements averaged far higher per victim than the Bhopal compensation. An American life, it seemed, was worth more than an Indian one. The mathematics of injustice was stark. Average compensation per Bhopal victim, roughly $500. Average compensation per American asbestos claimant, many times higher. Same company, same decades, different continents, different values assigned to human life. The disparity reflected not any difference in the severity of harm, but a difference in legal systems and the relative power of the parties. An American worker who developed lung disease from asbestos exposure could sue in American courts, where compensation standards were high and corporate defendants faced real consequences. An Indian slum dweller who lost her children to a gas leak had no such recourse. The settlement also did not account for the long-term health consequences that would emerge over the following decades. It was based on the assumption that the death toll was around 3,000 and that the injuries would heal over time. Both assumptions proved catastrophically wrong. As the years passed, the inadequacy of the settlement became more apparent. Victims who had received a few $100s discovered that their compensation would not cover a single month of medical treatment. Families who had lost their primary earners found themselves in permanent poverty. The money had seemed like a fortune to people who had nothing, but it proved to be nothing against the scale of their needs. The Indian Supreme Court later reversed the quashing of criminal charges, ruling that criminal proceedings could continue even after the civil settlement. But by then, Anderson had fled, and Union Carbide had established a pattern of refusing to acknowledge Indian jurisdiction. In June 2010, more than 25 years after the disaster, an Indian court finally convicted 7 former employees of Union Carbide India Limited of death by negligence. All were Indian citizens. None were senior executives. The maximum sentence under the applicable law was 2 years in prison. Most of the convicted men were in their 70s by the time of the verdict. No American executive was ever held accountable. Union Carbide Corporation never appeared in an Indian court. The company that designed the plant, provided the technology, cut the budgets, and reduced the safety standards was never made to answer for what it had done. The story might have ended there, a corporation avoiding responsibility, victims receiving inadequate compensation, the passage of time dulling the public's memory. But in 2001, something happened that brought new attention to Bhopal and raised new questions about corporate accountability. The Dow Chemical Company, one of the largest chemical corporations in the world, purchased Union Carbide in a deal worth approximately $11 billion. Union Carbide became a wholly owned subsidiary of Dow. Its assets and liabilities, under standard corporate merger law, became Dow's assets and liabilities. Dow was explicit about accepting some of Union Carbide's historical obligations. When Union Carbide faced asbestos litigation from American workers who had been exposed to carcinogenic materials at company facilities, Dow set aside $2.2 billion to settle the claims. The company acknowledged that acquiring Union Carbide meant inheriting its responsibilities. But not apparently its responsibilities in Bhopal. Dow has maintained consistently that it bears no liability for the Bhopal disaster. The company's position is that the disaster occurred 16 years before Dow acquired Union Carbide, that the 1989 settlement resolved all claims, and that Dow never owned or operated the Bhopal plant. These arguments contain elements of truth and elements of profound evasion. It is true that Dow did not own Union Carbide in 1984. It is also true that standard corporate law holds that when one company acquires another, it acquires both the assets and the liabilities. Dow cannot claim Union Carbide's patents and technologies while disclaiming its debts and obligations. It is true that the 1989 settlement was accepted by the Indian government. It is also true that the settlement was negotiated without meaningful input from the victims, that it was based on wildly inaccurate estimates of the death toll and long-term health consequences, and that it did not address ongoing environmental contamination at the site. It is true that Dow never operated the Bhopal plant. It is also true that Dow now controls Union Carbide completely, appoints its board of directors, manages its legal affairs, and receives its profits. Union Carbide's operations are fully integrated with Dow's. Its products are sold under Dow's name. Its employees report to Dow management. The relationship between Dow and Union Carbide is not that of two separate companies operating at arm's length. It is that of a parent corporation and a wholly owned subsidiary. Dow is Union Carbide. Union Carbide is Dow. The legal fiction of corporate separation cannot obscure the practical reality of unified control. And the practical reality on the ground in Bhopal is this. The disaster did not end in December 1984. The factory site was never properly cleaned up. Tons of toxic waste were left in open pits and storage tanks. Chemicals leached into the soil. They seeped into the groundwater. Studies conducted in the years after the disaster found alarming levels of contamination in the areas surrounding the plant. Mercury, lead, chromium, organochlorine compounds, pesticide residues. The groundwater in communities near the factory was found to contain chemicals at concentrations many times higher than safe limits. These were not the chemicals that caused the gas leak. This was a separate problem, the result of years of improper waste disposal during the plant's operation. Union Carbide had dumped hazardous materials on the site throughout the 1970s and 1980s. When the company abandoned the facility after the disaster, it left the waste behind. The contamination has affected an estimated 200,000 people in dozens of communities around the former plant. Residents report elevated rates of cancer, birth defects, kidney disease, and skin disorders. Women who drink the contaminated water suffer from reproductive problems. Children are born with developmental disabilities. In one neighborhood near the factory, residents describe water that turns whitish-green when left standing for hours. The water corrodes taps, tanks, and utensils. People who have no choice but to drink it suffer from skin diseases, allergies, kidney stones, and rising rates of heart conditions. Studies have found alarming levels of toxins in the groundwater: mercury, lead, chromium, organochlorine compounds at concentrations far exceeding safe limits, chemicals that have been linked to cancer, trichloroethylene, known to impair fetal development at 50 times above the safety limits set by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. In 2002, researchers found mercury, lead, and chloroform in the breast milk of women living near the plant. The poison was passing from mother to child, contaminating the next generation before it was even born. The contamination extends miles from the factory site. Studies have found pollutants in groundwater samples taken more than 3 kilometers away. The plume is spreading, carried by the natural flow of groundwater, poisoning new communities as it goes. The 1989 settlement did not address this contamination. It was a civil settlement for injuries caused by the gas leak. The ongoing poisoning of groundwater was and remains a separate legal matter. Under the polluter pays principle, which is enshrined in both American and international environmental law, the entity that caused the contamination is responsible for cleaning it up. That entity is Union Carbide. Union Carbide is now owned by Dow. The conclusion is straightforward. But Dow refuses to accept responsibility. The company claims that the state government of Madhya Pradesh owns the site and is therefore responsible for remediation. The state government points to Union Carbide and Dow. The blame circles endlessly while the poison continues to spread. In December 2024, 40 years after the disaster, the Madhya Pradesh High Court ordered that the site must be cleaned up within 1 month. In January 2025, trucks transported 377 tons of hazardous waste from the site to a disposal facility in another district. Residents along the route protested, fearful of contamination. The cleanup, if it can be called that, represented only a fraction of the waste that remains on the site. The groundwater contamination, which cannot be removed by loading waste onto trucks, continues to poison those who depend on it. UN human rights experts issued a statement on the 40th anniversary of the disaster. They called Bhopal a sacrifice zone, where pollution continues to harm people living in poverty. They noted that the contamination has affected soils and drinking water supplies for an estimated 200,000 people in 71 villages. They called for prompt action by India, the United States, and Dow Chemical to address the legacy of contamination and injustice. The legacy endures because the fundamental questions have never been resolved. Consider the economics of the Bhopal disaster. Union Carbide paid $470 million in settlement. The company's market value at the time was approximately $10 billion. The settlement represented roughly 4% of the company's worth. For killing, by conservative estimates, at least 15,000 people. For injuring more than 500,000. For contaminating the environment of a major city for generations. If Union Carbide had been held to the same standards as American companies in American courts, the liability would have been vastly higher. When the company settled asbestos claims from American workers, it paid an average per victim that was many times higher than the Bhopal compensation. The disparity reflected not any difference in the severity of harm, but a difference in the legal systems and the relative power of the parties. An American worker who developed lung disease from asbestos exposure could sue in American courts, where compensation standards were high and corporate defendants faced real consequences. An Indian slum dweller who lost her children to a gas leak had no such recourse. The Bhopal settlement established a price for mass industrial homicide in the developing world. That price was low enough to be absorbed as a cost of doing business, low enough that it did not fundamentally threaten the company's financial position, low enough that shareholders saw their stock rise when the settlement was announced. This is the moral arithmetic of multinational corporate liability. The victims of Bhopal were poor. They were far from American courtrooms. They had no political power. They could be compensated at a fraction of what American victims would have received. The savings accrued to shareholders. Consider also the economics of prevention. The safety measures that could have prevented the disaster were not expensive by corporate standards. Properly maintaining the refrigeration system for the MIC tanks, keeping the vent gas scrubber operational, maintaining adequate staffing levels, installing proper backup systems. These measures were reduced or eliminated to cut costs at a facility that was losing money. The savings were trivial in the context of Union Carbide's overall operations, a few $1,000,000 at most. But those savings contributed to a disaster whose costs, even counting only the settlement payment, ran to hundreds of millions. If you add the cleanup costs that have never been paid, the ongoing medical expenses, the lost productivity, the generational health impacts, the true cost of the disaster reaches into the billions. The cost-cutting made no economic sense even by the cold calculus of corporate self-interest. It was penny-wise and pound-foolish on a catastrophic scale. This is the paradox at the heart of corporate negligence. Companies cut safety expenditures to save money, but the savings are dwarfed by the costs of the disasters that follow. The executives who make those decisions are rarely the ones who bear the consequences. They have moved on to other positions, retired with comfortable pensions, died of natural causes, before the bill comes due. Warren Anderson retired from Union Carbide in 1986, 2 years after the disaster. He spent the next 28 years living in comfort beyond the reach of Indian justice. He was never prosecuted. He never paid a personal price for the decisions made under his leadership. The workers who died in Bhopal were not so fortunate. The residents of the slums around the factory were not so fortunate. Their children and grandchildren, still suffering from the effects of exposure and contamination, are not so fortunate. The question of who pays for industrial disasters has a clear answer in practice. The victims pay, the communities pay, the environment pays, the corporation absorbs a manageable settlement and moves on. But there is another question, harder to answer, that haunts the history of Bhopal. It is a question about knowledge and responsibility, about what corporations know and what they choose to do with that knowledge. Union Carbide knew the risks of methyl isocyanate. The company had handled the chemical for years at its Institute, West Virginia facility. It had developed elaborate safety protocols to contain the risks. It knew that MIC was extremely toxic, that it reacted violently with water, that exposure could be rapidly fatal. The company also knew that its Bhopal facility was operating with inferior safety standards. The Tyson Report of 1982 documented numerous deficiencies. Internal communications showed that executives in the United States were aware of problems at the Indian plant. They knew about the accidents, the leaks, the deteriorating equipment, the inadequate staffing. They knew, and they continued to cut costs. This is not inadvertence. This is not accident. This is a calculation that the risks were acceptable, that the potential costs were outweighed by the potential savings, that the lives of Indian workers and residents were worth less than the profit margins of an American corporation. The same calculation was made at Hawk's Nest half a century earlier. The company knew the risks of silica dust. It provided respirators to its engineers and inspectors. It did not provide them to the workers who were drilling through the rock. The pattern repeats because the incentives are aligned for it to repeat. Corporations face constant pressure to reduce costs and increase profits. Safety expenditures are costs. Dead workers and poisoned communities are liabilities that can be managed, settled, evaded, forgotten. Until they cannot be forgotten. Until they become synonymous with a company's name. Union Carbide will forever be associated with Bhopal. Whatever else the company accomplished in its century of existence, the batteries and plastics and industrial chemicals will be overshadowed by the image of bodies in the streets of an Indian city. Dow Chemical acquired that legacy along with Union Carbide's assets. Every year, on the anniversary of the disaster, protesters gather outside Dow facilities around the world. They burn effigies. They demand justice. They refuse to let the corporation forget what it now owns. The survivors of Bhopal have organized and demonstrated and litigated for 40 years. They have marched to Delhi and traveled to the United States. They have testified before legislatures and spoken to journalists. They have buried their dead and raised their damaged children and continued to fight. Activists have played a crucial role in keeping the issue alive. Satynath Sarangi, a metallurgical engineer, arrived in Bhopal the day after the disaster and never left. He founded the Sambhavna Trust, which operates a free clinic for gas-affected patients. He has spent 4 decades documenting the effects of the disaster and advocating for the victims. Rashida B. and Champa Devi Shukla, 2 women who survived the gas leak, became prominent activists in the struggle for justice. In 2004, they received the Goldman Environmental Prize, one of the world's most prestigious awards for grassroots environmental activism. They used the platform to draw international attention to the ongoing suffering in Bhopal. Abdul Jabbar and Rachna Dhingra have continued the fight for decades. They have organized demonstrations, coordinated with international supporters, and maintained pressure on corporations and governments. They have been arrested, threatened, and sued, but they have not stopped. Every year on the anniversary of the disaster, survivors march through the streets of Bhopal. They carry torches and banners. They chant slogans demanding justice. They burn effigies of Warren Anderson. The ritual has continued for 40 years. The protests have spread beyond India. Supporters around the world hold solidarity events on December 3rd. They gather outside Dow chemical facilities to demand accountability. They send letters and sign petitions and contact their elected representatives. The International Campaign for Justice in Bhopal has built a global network of activists, scientists, lawyers, and supporters. They have documented the ongoing health effects. They have challenged corporate claims in court. They have refused to let the world forget what happened. The disaster still continues to kill and to disable a new generation, one activist said at a 2024 event. And the perpetrators responsible for this continue to enjoy happy and rich lives. The corporations continue to do business as usual. Some of them are now in their 70s and 80s, still waiting for adequate compensation, still drinking contaminated water, still suffering from chronic illnesses that began on that December night in 1984. Others were not yet born when the gas leaked. They are the children and grandchildren of the exposed, carrying genetic damage that was not their fault and cannot be undone. They are a living reminder that industrial disasters do not end when the smoke clears. The women of Bhopal have been particularly affected. Studies have documented elevated rates of reproductive disorders, menstrual irregularities, and pregnancy complications in the exposed population. Birth defects are more common. Stillbirths are more common. The gas damaged not just those who breathed it, but those who would be born to them in the years that followed. One woman who was a child during the disaster lost a sister to renal failure at age 24. Another sister is on dialysis. The survivor herself works at a clinic treating gas-affected patients, helping others while dealing with her own health problems. These are the human costs that cannot be captured in settlement figures or death toll statistics. The years of illness, the premature deaths, the children who never had a chance at healthy lives, the families broken by grief and medical expenses, and the grinding difficulty of survival. What does justice look like for Bhopal? The survivors have demanded several things over the years: adequate medical care for those who are still suffering, clean drinking water for the communities around the contaminated site, proper cleanup of the factory grounds and the surrounding area, prosecution of those responsible for the disaster, additional compensation commensurate with the actual harm caused. 40 years on, none of these demands have been fully met. Medical care for the gas-affected has improved somewhat, but remains inadequate. The Indian government established hospitals and clinics to treat survivors, but the facilities are underfunded and overwhelmed. Many victims cannot access the care they need. The Sambhavna Health Clinic, founded by survivors and activists in 1996, provides free medical treatment using both conventional and traditional methods. It operates independently of government support, funded largely by donations from abroad. It is a testament to the resilience of the survivors and an indictment of the failure of governments and corporations to meet their obligations. Clean water has been partially addressed. The Indian Supreme Court ordered that affected communities be supplied with clean drinking water in 2004. The Madhya Pradesh government installed a pipeline from the Narmada River to provide alternative water sources. But the system is unreliable, and many residents still depend on contaminated groundwater when the piped supply fails. Cleanup of the site has barely begun. The 2025 removal of hazardous waste was a small step after decades of inaction. The groundwater contamination continues. The soil remains poisoned. The full remediation that experts have called for has never been undertaken. Criminal prosecution has failed. Union Carbide Corporation has never appeared in an Indian court. Warren Anderson died without facing trial. The convictions of Indian employees in 2010 were widely seen as inadequate, punishing low-level managers while the decision-makers in the American parent company escaped accountability. Additional compensation has not been forthcoming. The 1989 settlement was based on grossly underestimated death tolls and injury figures. The Indian government filed a curative petition seeking additional compensation, but the Supreme Court dismissed it in 2023. The victims remain bound by a settlement that was never adequate to the scale of their suffering. Justice for Bhopal would require something that neither corporations nor governments seem willing to provide. It would require an acknowledgement that the lives of poor people in developing countries have the same value as the lives of wealthy people in developed countries. It would require that corporations face the same consequences for negligence abroad as they face at home. It would require that the victims of industrial disasters have meaningful access to legal remedies against the corporations that harmed them. These are not utopian demands. They are basic principles of fairness and accountability that are routinely violated when multinational corporations operate in countries with weaker regulatory systems and poorer populations. Bhopal was not an anomaly. It was a particularly severe example of a pattern that repeats around the world. Corporations export their most hazardous operations to places where regulations are loose and workers are desperate. They maintain inferior safety standards abroad because the costs of doing so are lower than the costs of maintaining the standards they would be required to meet at home. When disasters occur, they leverage legal complexity and jurisdictional boundaries to limit their liability. The globalized economy has created new opportunities for this kind of regulatory arbitrage. A company can design a product in one country, manufacture it in another, and sell it in a third. When something goes wrong, responsibility is diffused across borders. Victims face the daunting task of pursuing claims in foreign legal systems against defendants with vastly greater resources. This is the context in which Bhopal must be understood, not as an isolated tragedy, but as a case study in the mechanisms by which corporations externalize risk onto vulnerable populations. The people of Bhopal paid for Union Carbide's cost-cutting with their health and their lives. They continue to pay decades later. And the question that the disaster raises, the question that has never been adequately answered, is whether this is inevitable. Whether the global economy must operate on the principle that some lives are worth less than others. Whether there is any way to hold corporations accountable for the harm they cause, regardless of where that harm occurs. The chemical industry did learn some lessons from Bhopal. In the years after the disaster, industry associations developed what they called responsible care programs, voluntary initiatives to improve safety standards and community awareness. Union Carbide participated in these efforts. So did Dow Chemical. These programs have had some positive effects. Safety practices have improved at many facilities. Emergency response planning has become more sophisticated. Information sharing about hazardous materials has increased. But voluntary programs have inherent limitations. They rely on the good faith of the corporations that implement them. They lack the enforcement mechanisms of government regulation. They can be undermined by competitive pressures and cost considerations, the same pressures that led to the deterioration of safety at Bhopal. And the fundamental power imbalance remains. Multinational corporations can choose where to locate their operations. They can move to jurisdictions with lower standards. They can leverage their economic importance to resist regulation. Communities that host their facilities often lack the resources to monitor their operations or the political power to demand accountability. This imbalance is not accidental. It is built into the structure of the global economy. It serves the interests of corporations and their shareholders at the expense of workers and communities. It treats the externalization of risk as a legitimate business strategy rather than as a form of injustice. Changing this structure would require political action on a global scale. It would require international agreements that establish minimum safety standards and provide for cross-border enforcement. It would require strengthening the capacity of developing countries to regulate hazardous industries. It would require creating legal mechanisms that allow victims of corporate negligence to seek remedies regardless of where they live. These changes are possible, but they face powerful opposition. The corporations that benefit from the current system have enormous resources to influence policy. Governments in developing countries often prioritize economic development over environmental and safety regulation. International institutions lack the authority to compel compliance. And so the pattern continues. Hazardous facilities operate in communities that cannot effectively monitor them. Safety standards slip when competitive pressures increase. Disasters occur. Victims struggle for compensation. Corporations deny responsibility. Time passes. Memory fades. Until the next disaster reminds us of what we already knew. The factory in Bhopal still stands. Its rusting tanks and corroded pipes are a monument to industrial negligence. Children play in the fields nearby, unaware of the chemicals that saturate the soil beneath their feet. Every year on December 3rd, survivors gather at the site. They hold candles. They speak the names of the dead. They burn effigies of Warren Anderson and Union Carbide and Dow Chemical. They demand the justice they have been seeking for 4 decades. They are growing older. The first generation of survivors is dying off, not only from the effects of the gas, but from the simple passage of time. Their children have taken up the cause. Their grandchildren know the stories. The fight continues because the injustice continues, because the site remains contaminated, because the victims remain inadequately compensated, because the corporations that caused the disaster have never been held properly accountable. And the fight continues because Bhopal has become something larger than itself. A symbol of everything that can go wrong when profit is prioritized over safety, when corporations operate beyond effective regulation, when the lives of the poor and the marginalized are treated as expendable. The residents of Bhopal did not choose to live next to a pesticide factory. They settled there because that is where they could afford to live, in the informal settlements that grew up around the industrial zone, outside the protections of proper zoning and planning. They were poor. They were vulnerable. They trusted that the factory would not kill them. That trust was betrayed. The question now is what we do with the knowledge of that betrayal. Whether we allow it to fade into history as just another industrial disaster, another unfortunate incident in the long march of progress, or whether we use it to demand something better. The survivors of Bhopal have chosen the second path. Despite everything, they have not given up. They have organized and educated and demonstrated and litigated. They have forced the world to remember what happened in their city. They have done this without resources, without political power, without any of the advantages that their opponents possess. They have done it through persistence and courage, and the simple refusal to be forgotten. There is a lesson in their struggle. It is that injustice does not correct itself, that corporations will not voluntarily accept responsibility for the harm they cause, that governments cannot be trusted to protect the vulnerable from the powerful, that justice requires constant vigilance and continuous effort. The survivors understand this. They have learned it through bitter experience over 40 years. And they continue to fight, because the alternative is to accept that their suffering meant nothing, that the deaths of their loved ones can be settled for $500, that the poisoning of their community will go on forever. They refuse to accept this, and so they march, and so they demand, and so they remember. The night of December 2nd and 3, 1984. The cloud of gas drifting over a sleeping city, the chaos and the death and the desperate flight. The years of illness that followed. The children born damaged, the premature deaths, the contaminated water that people still drink because they have no alternative. The legal battles and the inadequate settlements, the executives who escaped accountability, the corporation that walked away. The ongoing contamination that no one will clean up, the medical problems that no one will properly treat, the justice that no one will deliver. All of this they remember. All of this they refuse to forget. And in their refusal is a kind of resistance, a rejection of the logic that says their lives are worth less than others, an assertion of their humanity against systems that treat them as costs to be minimized. They are still here, damaged but not destroyed, aging but not silent, waiting for justice that may never come, but refusing to stop waiting. The factory stands, the contamination spreads, the survivors remember. And the question that echoes through 4 decades of grief and struggle remains unanswered. Who pays when progress kills? Who is responsible when corporations value profit over human life? Who will clean up the poison and care for the sick and compensate the families of the dead? Bhopal asked these questions in the most devastating way possible. The world has not yet provided adequate answers. Perhaps it never will. Perhaps the logic of global capitalism will continue to externalize costs onto those who cannot resist it. Perhaps the next Bhopal is already taking shape somewhere, in some other factory, in some other community, where the pressure to cut costs is overwhelming safety systems that someone decided were too expensive to maintain. Or perhaps Bhopal will stand as a turning point, a disaster so catastrophic that it forced a reckoning, a symbol so powerful that it changed the way corporations operate and governments regulate. The survivors hope for the second outcome. They have dedicated their lives to achieving it. The corporations that caused their suffering hope for the first. They have dedicated their resources to ensuring it. And the rest of us watch and choose sides and decide, through our action or our indifference, which future we will create. The night air over Bhopal is clean now. The factory is silent. The dead are buried. But the story is not over. It continues in the bodies of the survivors and their children. It continues in the contaminated groundwater and the unpaid debts. It continues in the courtrooms where cases still grind forward and the boardrooms where executives still deny responsibility. It continues because the underlying conditions that produced it have not changed. Corporations still face pressure to cut costs. Safety standards still vary between rich countries and poor ones. The lives of marginalized people are still treated as worth less than the lives of the privileged. Until these conditions change, Bhopal will not be the last such disaster. It was not the first, it will not be the last. But it can be remembered, it can be learned from, it can be used to demand something better. That is what the survivors are doing. That is what they have been doing for 40 years. They are keeping the memory alive. They are refusing to let the world forget. They are insisting that their suffering has meaning, that their struggle has purpose, that their voices will be heard. In that insistence is a kind of hope, not naive hope, not optimistic hope, hope that has been tested by 4 decades of disappointment and loss. But hope nonetheless, hope that justice is possible, hope that corporations can be held accountable, hope that the lives of the poor matter as much as the lives of the rich. Hope that one day the answer to the question of who pays will be different. The sun sets over Bhopal. The survivors gather at the factory gates. They light their candles against the darkness. And they remember.